The moment Dorothy Brenner walked into the Silver Creek General Store and overheard Roscoe Donnelly telling half the town he intended to court her, she very nearly turned around and walked right back out into the blazing Arizona sun without a single word, because she had heard that kind of talk before, and she had learned in the most painful way imaginable that talk from a handsome man meant absolutely nothing at all. It was the spring of 1878, and Silver Creek was the sort of small frontier town that sat in the high desert of the Arizona Territory like a stubborn seed, refusing to be blown away by the dry wind that swept down off the Superstition Mountains every afternoon without fail. The town had a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other with a little room to spare, a church with a crooked steeple, a telegraph office that had been humming with news since the railroad started pushing westward, a saloon that never closed entirely, a blacksmith, a livery, and the general store owned by a round-faced man named Edgar Potts who knew everybody's business and was not shy about sharing it. Dorothy Brenner had come to Silver Creek 8 months earlier from Santa Fe, where she had taught school for 2 years following the death of her mother. She was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed straw hat, sharp green eyes that could read a person's character in about 30 seconds flat, and a disposition that her late father had once described as warm as a summer day, and twice as stubborn as any mule he had ever met. She had taken over the schoolhouse in Silver Creek when the previous teacher, a nervous young man named Mr. Filbert, had discovered that frontier children were considerably less civilized than he had anticipated and had taken the next stage back east. Dorothy did not scare easily. She had managed a classroom of 22 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old, including the Haskell boys, who were infamous throughout the territory for their creative approach to disruption. She had won them over in 3 weeks by the simple method of refusing to be intimidated by any of them, and teaching them things they actually wanted to know, like why lightning struck the tallest tree and how to read a map and calculate the distance between 2 points on the land. She had not, however, come to Silver Creek looking for a man. The last man she had trusted with her heart had been a lawyer in Santa Fe named Gerald Whitmore, who had told her beautiful things for 6 months, made promises that lit her up from the inside, and then married a banker's daughter from Albuquerque without so much as a letter of explanation. Dorothy had found out from a neighbor who had read about the wedding in the newspaper, and she had spent exactly 2 days feeling sorry for herself before she packed her bags and decided that if she was going to build a life on her own terms, she might as well do it somewhere that actually needed her. Silver Creek needed her. That part was certain. What she had not counted on was Roscoe Donnelly. He had come to the territory 3 years before her, riding up from Texas with 2 other cowboys and a reputation as one of the finest horse trainers in the Southwest. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark sun-browned skin, deep brown eyes that had the kind of steadiness in them that made people feel oddly calm even in the middle of a crisis, and a jaw that always seemed to be carrying a day or 2 of dark stubble, no matter how often he shaved. He worked a ranch about 4 miles outside of town owned by a man named Calvin Hurst, and he was known in Silver Creek as a man who kept his word, never started trouble, and could break a wild horse with a patience so quiet it looked almost like a conversation between him and the animal. He was also known for not saying much, which was why, when Dorothy heard him standing at the counter of Edgar Potts's store and telling old Edgar in a very matter-of-fact voice that he was going to court Dorothy Brenner if she would allow it, she was so shocked that she pressed herself against the shelving near the door and actually listened instead of announcing herself. "She is the finest woman I have ever laid eyes on," Roscoe was saying, and his voice was low and even the way he spoke about everything. "And I have been thinking on it for about 4 months now. I am going to ask her properly. She doesn't strike me as the type to be easily impressed," Edgar said, with the cheerful bluntness of a man who found other people's business genuinely entertaining. She shouldn't be easily impressed, Roscoe said. A woman like that has earned the right to be particular. Dorothy stood very still in the aisle between the bolts of calico fabric and the shelves of canned goods, her heart doing something she refused to name, and then she straightened her spine, set her jaw, picked up a tin of baking powder and a spool of dark blue thread, and walked to the counter as if she had heard nothing at all. Roscoe turned when he heard her boots on the wooden floor. He did not flush or look away or make any of the foolish gestures a caught man might make. He just looked at her steadily and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Brenner," he said. "Mr. Donnelly," she said. Edgar Potts looked between them with the barely contained delight of a man watching a particularly good hand of cards being played out. Dorothy set her items on the counter and waited while Edgar tallied the price. She could feel Roscoe still standing there. She picked up her wrapped parcels, said a polite goodbye to Edgar, and was almost to the door when Roscoe spoke. "Miss Brenner," he said again, and something in the quality of his voice made her stop. "I would consider it a privilege to call on you this Sunday, if you would permit it." She turned and looked at him. His hat was in his hands now, which surprised her. He was not performing humility the way some men did. He just looked straightforward and honest and entirely too sure of himself for a man who had just been caught talking about her to the town gossip. "I have heard," she said carefully, "that you are a man who means what he says, Mr. Donnelly." "I try to be," he said. "Then I will tell you plainly that I am not interested in being courted," she said. "I have a life I am content with and a job I love, and I did not come to Silver Creek looking for a husband." "I am not asking to be a project," he said, and there was no offense in his voice, just that same steady quality. "I am asking if I can bring you Sunday supper and sit on your porch and talk to you. That is all." She studied him for a moment that stretched long enough to make Edgar actually hold his breath. "Sunday," she said at last. "And I mean what I say too, Mr. Donnelly. I'm not easily won." "Good," he said simply, and put his hat back on his head. She walked out into the sunlight and the warm, dry wind, and she told herself very firmly that the fluttering sensation in her chest was nothing but irritation. She was not entirely convinced. Sunday arrived with the kind of clear golden sky that made the desert look like it had been painted by someone who loved it without reservation. Dorothy had told herself she was not going to make any special effort, and then she had spent a considerable amount of time on her hair and changed her dress twice before settling on a blue cotton one that she told herself she wore because it was the most comfortable, not because the color suited her particularly well. Roscoe arrived precisely at 5 in the afternoon, which was the hour she had named when she had communicated through the impossibly efficient network of Silver Creek gossip that Sunday supper was acceptable. He came on a good bay horse and brought with him a basket that contained a whole roasted chicken still warm from someone's oven, a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, and a small crock of butter, all packed with a neatness that suggested he had thought it through carefully. "I did not cook any of this myself," he said honestly, setting the basket on her small porch table. "Mrs. Alvarez at the boarding house made it. I thought you should know that before you formed any opinions about my domestic abilities." Dorothy laughed before she could stop herself. It was such an unexpected thing to say. "That is either very honest or a very clever way to lower my expectations," she said. "Both," he said, and smiled, and the smile was slower than she expected, like the sun coming up over a ridge, and it changed his face entirely. They ate on the porch while the sun went down behind the mountains and turned the sky into a long theater of orange and purple and deep rose. He asked her about the school. Not the polite, half-interested questions she was used to, but real questions, about what she was teaching and what the children struggled with, and what she thought a proper education meant for children growing up on the frontier. She talked more than she intended to. She told him about how she had started a small library with donated books, and how she was teaching the older girls not just reading and arithmetic but basic accounting and legal literacy, because she believed strongly that a woman who could not understand a contract or a deed was a woman who could be cheated out of everything she owned. "That is forward thinking," he said, and he did not say it with any of the condescension she had come to expect. He said it like he was noting an admirable truth. "It is practical thinking," she said. "I have seen what happens to women who depend entirely on someone else to manage their affairs." There was a pause in which she heard, distantly, the sound of someone playing a harmonica in the direction of the saloon and a horse blowing somewhere in the dark. "You have been burned," he said. It was not a question. It was said quietly with no prying in it, just the simple acknowledgement of something he had heard in her words. "That is a personal matter," she said evenly. "It is," he agreed. "And I have no business asking about it. I just want you to know that I hear you, Miss Brenner. I hear what you are saying underneath the words." She looked at him in the dying light. He was looking out at the mountains, giving her the privacy of not being watched while she absorbed that. Something in her chest shifted, like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten was there. He left at a proper hour. He did not try to take her hand or say anything romantic. He thanked her for her company, told her it was the best Sunday he had spent in 3 years, and rode back toward the Hearst ranch in the full dark. She stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone, looking at the stars, which out here in the Arizona territory came out in such numbers they made you feel very small and very alive at the same time. She told herself again that she was not impressed. She knew she was lying. He called on her again 2 weeks later, and then once a week after that through the warm spring months. He always brought supper, and he always asked about the school, and he always listened with his whole attention the way that very few people listened, really listened to anything. He told her about Texas, where he had grown up on a cattle ranch run by his father, a taciturn man who had communicated love through teaching his son every skill he knew rather than through words. He told her about why he had come west, about wanting more than the particular kind of smallness he felt back home, about how the territory felt to him like a place where a man could become the version of himself he was actually meant to be. He told her, one evening in late May when the desert was still warm from the day, but the night air was coming in cool and fragrant with sage, that he had never been the kind of man who said things he did not mean. He said it without any particular drama, just as a fact about himself. He had seen too many men who used words as currency, spending them freely because they cost nothing, and he had decided young that he would not be one of them. "Words should mean exactly what they say," he told her. "Nothing more and nothing less. When I say a thing, I want it to weigh something." She thought about that for a long time after he left that night. She thought about the difference between Gerald Whitmore, who had spoken in beautiful, elaborate sentences that had ultimately meant nothing at all, and this man who spoke plainly and whose plainness felt, somehow, richer and fuller than all of Gerald's elegance had ever been. She was falling. She knew it the way you know when a weather change is coming before there is a single cloud in the sky. She could feel it in the way she looked forward to Sundays with an anticipation that disrupted her whole week, in the way she caught herself thinking about things he had said in the middle of a lesson and having to pull herself firmly back to her students, in the way his name sounded in her own mind like something she wanted to say out loud. She did not say it out loud. She did not encourage him any more than she had been. She remained the version of herself that was careful and self-contained, because she was not going to be made a fool of again, and she was not going to let a man's good intentions, real or imagined, rearrange her life around him. What happened next was not something she had planned for. It was a Saturday afternoon in June when the Haskell boys, who were 8 and 11 respectively, got into a fight with the Morales boy, who was 9, on the main street of Silver Creek. It was the kind of fight that small-town boys had regularly, involving fists and dirt and a great deal of noise. But what made this one different was that 2 adult men from the Haskell ranch were watching and laughing, and making comments that Dorothy, who came upon the scene from the direction of the schoolhouse, found so deeply ugly that she walked right into the middle of it without thinking. She pulled the boys apart with the firm, practiced efficiency of a woman who had been managing children in confined spaces for years, and she turned to the two ranch hands and told them in a very clear voice that their behavior was shameful and that she expected better from grown men regardless of who they worked for. One of them, a big man with a red face and small eyes, said something back to her that she was not going to repeat in polite company now or ever. She was still standing very straight and not backing down when Roscoe appeared from the direction of the livery. He had come into town for supplies and had heard the commotion. He walked to her side without hurrying, which somehow made him seem more formidable rather than less, and he stood there next to her and looked at the two ranch hands with those steady brown eyes until both of them found reasons to look away. "I believe the lady asked you to behave like men," Roscoe said. His voice was conversational. "I would take that advice." The red-faced man grumbled something, and the other one elbowed him and they walked off. Roscoe turned to the three boys, who were dusty and disheveled and looking at him with varying degrees of guilt. "You boys all right?" he asked. They were. He spoke to them quietly for a moment, not scolding, just a practical word about the foolishness of fighting on a public street where accidents happen, and then sent them off in their respective directions. Dorothy was looking at him. He turned to her. "Thank you," she said, and then, because it was true, she said, "You did not need to do that. I had the situation in hand." "I know you did," he said simply. "I just did not want you to be standing alone." That was the moment. She would know it later as the exact moment, the pivot point around which everything before and everything after arranged itself. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not a gallant rescue. It was just a man saying that he did not want her to stand alone. She had been standing alone for a very long time. She went home that evening and sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold because she forgot to drink it, and she had a long, honest conversation with herself about what she was afraid of and why. And she came to the conclusion that the reason she was holding Roscoe Donnelly at arm's length was not because she doubted him. It was because she doubted herself. She doubted her own ability to choose rightly, to see clearly, to trust her own judgment about a man's character again. But sitting there in the quiet of her small house with the night sounds of the desert coming through the open window, she thought about the fact that she had watched him for 5 months now. She had watched him with the children who came to her school, the ones he encountered in town, and he was always the same with them, patient and direct and kind. She had watched him with the men he worked alongside, and with Calvin Hurst, and with the elderly Mexican woman who sold tamales from a cart on Saturday mornings, and whom most of the town barely acknowledged. He was always the same. He did not perform goodness for people he thought were watching. He just was who he was, consistently and without variation. That was not Gerald Whitmore. That was something entirely different. The following Sunday he came again, and something must have been different in her face, because he looked at her when she opened the door and then looked at her again more carefully, the way a man looks when he is trying to read the weather. "You are thinking about something," he said. "I am always thinking about something," she said, and let him in. They sat on the porch again. The desert was loud with insects in the warm summer night, and the moon was 3/4 full and rising behind the mountain ridge. He had brought biscuits and a jar of plum preserves from the ranch kitchen, and she had made iced tea, which was a luxury but manageable given that the iceman had come through on Friday. They talked for a while about easy things, the news from Tucson about the railroad expansion, about the small matter of the Silver Creek Church needing a new roof, and whether the community would raise the funds in time before the monsoon season, about a particularly spectacular display of lightning she had watched from her window the previous Tuesday night. And then she put her glass down and looked at him. "Roscoe," she said. He looked back at her, attentive and unhurried. "I need to tell you something," she said, "because I think honesty is the only currency worth spending between two people." "I agree entirely," he said. "I am not entirely indifferent to you," she said. The words cost her something to say them. She could feel it, like releasing something she had been holding very tightly. "I think you are a good man. I think you are probably one of the best men I have met. And I find myself looking forward to Sundays, which I did not expect and did not want, and which I have been arguing with myself about for some time." He was very still. He was listening the way he always listened, with his entire self. "But I have been hurt before," she said, "by a man who said all the right things and meant none of them. And it took me a long time to trust myself again after that. So I need you to understand that when I say I am cautious, it is not about you specifically. It is about the fact that I cannot afford to be wrong again." He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Not the silence of a man gathering words quickly, but the silence of a man who was taking what she said seriously enough to sit with it. "I appreciate you telling me that," he said at last. "It is not easy to say something like that. It takes courage." "I am not lacking in courage," she said, a little wryly. "No," he agreed, and there was warmth in his voice that made the word feel like a compliment of the highest order. "What I want you to know, Dorothy, is that I am not asking you to take any action you are not ready for. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere. I have waited a long time already to find someone worth being serious about." She looked at him steadily. "How serious are you?" she said. "And I ask that plainly because I have no patience for ambiguity." "I am absolutely serious," he said. "I want to court you proper, with the full intention of asking you to be my wife when you are ready and willing to hear such a question. That is where I stand." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face must have showed what she was thinking, because he read it. "You do not believe me," he said. There was no accusation in it, just recognition. "I want to," she said honestly. "That is different from saying I do." He nodded slowly. There was a pause, and then, without any theatrical gesture or flourish, he reached into the chest pocket of his shirt and drew out a small folded piece of paper and a short pencil stub. He set the paper on the porch railing and wrote for a moment, his handwriting careful and deliberate the way everything about him was deliberate. Then he folded it once and held it out to her. "Then let me prove it in writing," he said. She took the paper and opened it. In his even, unadorned handwriting it said exactly this: "I, Roscoe Donnelly, being of sound mind and honest intention, do here declare that I am entirely serious in my regard for Dorothy Brenner, that my purpose in calling on her is honorable and permanent, and that it is my sincere hope to one day have the privilege of asking her to share my life with me. I do not make promises lightly, and this paper should stand as proof that this is not a light matter." Below it he had signed his full name, Roscoe James Donnelly. She read it twice. Her throat did something unexpected, and she controlled it, because she was not going to cry on her own porch over a piece of paper, even if it was possibly the most direct and honest thing anyone had ever handed her in her life. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady gaze, not anxious, just present. "This is a legal declaration," she said, and her voice was a little uneven at the edges. "It is a promise," he said. "I do not know if it holds up in court, but it holds with me, and that is what counts." She folded the paper carefully and held it in her hands. "You realize," she said, "that I am going to keep this." "I would be disappointed if you did not," he said. Something broke open in her chest then, not painfully, but the way a window breaks open on a hot day to let a cool breeze through, and she looked at this man on her porch with his honest eyes and his deliberate words and his paper promise, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, she was not as bad at reading people as Gerald Whitmore had made her believe. "All right, Roscoe Donnelly," she said. "I will give you a fair and open chance." He smiled then, the slow sunrise of a smile. "That is all I am asking for, Dorothy Brenner," he said. They sat on the porch until the moon was high and bright above the mountains, and this time the conversation was different, lighter and warmer, like two people who had been standing on opposite sides of a river and had finally found the crossing. She kept the note. She folded it and tucked it inside the cover of her Bible, between the pages where the world was most reliably steady. The summer moved through its long blazing days with a heat that turned the air into something visible and shimmering above the hard-packed earth of Silver Creek's Main Street. Dorothy kept teaching through the summer months, because she had convinced the town council that children in the territory learned differently if they had the continuity. And she was right. And even the council members who had argued against it admitted by August that her students were doing remarkably well. Roscoe came every Sunday, and on Wednesday evenings he had taken to stopping by with some small thing, a book he thought she might like borrowed from the small lending collection at the trading post, a jar of the mesquite honey that a Tohono O'odham trader brought through town, once a handful of wild desert flowers that he had clearly stopped to pick on the road, and which were slightly wilted but no less touching for it. She took the flowers and put them in water, and they lasted 3 more days, and she looked at them in her kitchen window every morning and felt something she was only barely beginning to let herself name. She had told her friend and neighbor, a woman named Cecilia Morales, who was married to the town's blacksmith and who had 3 children including the boy who had been in the fight on Main Street back in June, about the note. She had shown Cecilia the paper. Cecilia, who was a practical and straight-spoken woman of 30 with quick dark eyes and no patience for nonsense of any kind, had read it and looked up at Dorothy with an expression that was something between admiration and exasperation. "Dorothy," she said, "this man wrote you a declaration of intention on a porch at night with a pencil stub because you did not believe him. What more evidence do you need?" "I know," Dorothy said. "Do you like him?" "More than I am entirely comfortable with," Dorothy admitted. "Good," Cecilia said. "Discomfort means you care. Comfort too soon usually means you are not paying attention." Dorothy laughed at that. "That is a terrible piece of wisdom," she said. "It is the most accurate piece of wisdom I own," Cecilia said cheerfully. August brought the monsoon rains, which rolled in over the mountains in the late afternoons, with a grandeur that never stopped feeling extraordinary to Dorothy, no matter how many times she watched it. The sky would build clouds like dark castles all through the heat of the day, and then, somewhere after 3 in the afternoon, the thunder would start, and the lightning would begin to flicker in the distance, and the wind would come rushing down off the high ground smelling of wet rock and rain before a single drop had fallen. Then the rain would arrive, not gently but with tremendous purpose, turning the dry arroyos into roaring brown rivers in minutes and cooling the air by 20 degrees in what felt like seconds. Dorothy loved the monsoons. They felt honest. They announced themselves fully, gave everything they had, and then cleared away and left the desert smelling like something new. It was during one of these storms, on a Wednesday evening in late August, that Roscoe arrived at her door not with the usual small gift, but with a look on his face that was new, an uncertainty she had never seen in him before, and she noticed it immediately. She let him in out of the rain, which was still hammering on the roof in sheets, and made coffee on the stove while he sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and she set a cup in front of him and sat across from him. "What has happened?" she said. He looked at the coffee cup. "Calvin Hurst has offered me a partnership," he said, "not a small one. He is getting older, his sons are not interested in the ranch, and he wants to take on a partner who will eventually take over the operation. It is a good offer, a very good offer." "That sounds like wonderful news," she said carefully, because his face suggested there was more. "The condition," he said, looking up at her now, "is that it has to be someone settled, someone with a stake in the land and a reason to stay. He is very direct about it. He wants a man who has roots here or is actively putting them down." She looked at him across the table. The rain was very loud on the roof. "You are telling me," she said, "that this offer changes the timeline of what you said to me on the porch." "I am telling you," he said, "that I am not going to pressure you, not for anything in the world. I would turn down Calvin Hurst's offer before I would rush you into a decision you are not ready to make. I just thought you deserved to know because you told me you valued honesty, and you do, and so do I, and this is the kind of thing that honesty requires me to say." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the thunder rolled across the sky in one long, shuddering wave. "How long do you have?" she said. "He wants an answer before winter," Roscoe said. "He is not asking me to be married by winter. He is asking if I am working toward a settled life. But I cannot tell him that without knowing where things stand with you, because you are the only person I am working toward a settled life with. That is the honest truth." She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. He had never once in all the months she had known him looked away when something was hard. "You told me," she said slowly, "on that piece of paper that your intention was honorable and permanent." "It is," he said. "I have been thinking," she said, "for several weeks that I believe that. I want you to know that. I have been sitting with it carefully because I do not do things quickly and I do not make decisions without thinking them through. But I have been thinking them through, Roscoe. I have been thinking about what you said and how you have been and the kind of man I have watched you be, not just to me but to everyone around you." He was very still. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "And that took me a long time to get to because I was afraid before. Not of you specifically, but of being wrong again. But I am not afraid of you. I trust you. That is something I do not say casually." His hands, which had been still on the table, moved. He turned his right hand over so that it rested open on the table between them. An invitation, not a demand. She reached across and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. The rain kept falling. The thunder rolled away into the distance. The lamplight made the kitchen feel like the inside of something safe and contained, a small world they had built together over 5 months of careful, honest, deliberate conversation. "Tell Calvin Hurst yes," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were doing something she had never seen them do before. The steadiness was still there, but underneath it was something else, something raw and real and enormously tender. "You are certain," he said. "I am certain that I want to see what we could be," she said. "I am certain that I do not want to stand on the outside of my own life watching it go by because I am too afraid. And I am certain," she said, and this part was harder and she said it anyway, "that I am in love with you, Roscoe Donnelly. I have been for some time. I have just been arguing with myself about saying it." He stood up slowly, still holding her hand, and she stood too, and he looked at her the way someone looks at something they cannot quite believe is real and do not want to disturb by looking away. "Dorothy," he said, and her name in his voice was a different thing than it was in anyone else's voice. "I have been in love with you since the day I watched you walk into that general store, and I could tell from the way you moved that you were a woman who was absolutely nobody's fool and absolutely nobody's decoration. I thought then that any man who got to love a woman like that was about the luckiest thing that could happen in a person's life." She was not crying. She was absolutely not going to cry. She blinked once and decided firmly that she was not. "That is a good thing to say," she managed. "I meant every word of it," he said. "You can check the paper I wrote it on." She laughed, and it came out a little unsteady. And then his arms were around her and she was holding on to him. And she thought that the funny and remarkable thing about all of this was how completely right it felt. How there was not a single inch of doubt left in her when it came down to it. Just this man and this moment and the rain on the roof and the lamp burning yellow in her kitchen. He kissed her temple first, carefully, and then she turned her face up and he kissed her properly, and that was its own kind of conversation, honest and steady and whole. The following months were full. September and October brought the ranching work that came with the end of the monsoon season, and Roscoe was busy with Calvin Hurst's cattle and the business of formally entering into the partnership agreement, which required a great deal of paperwork and several trips to the county seat in Tucson. Dorothy drove the school into the fall semester with the new energy of a woman who had stopped spending most of her internal resources on managing her own fears, and it showed in her work. She expanded the library, began holding an evening class twice a week for adults in town who had never had proper schooling, and negotiated with the town council for a second small room to be added to the schoolhouse building. She and Roscoe saw each other as often as the work allowed, which was not always Sundays anymore because October on a working ranch cared nothing for the social calendar. He would come when he could, and she would ride out to the Hurst ranch when the weather was good, and Calvin Hurst, who turned out to be a wiry, sunburned man of 60 with a dry wit and a genuine appreciation for capable people, took one look at Dorothy and told Roscoe in front of her that he had made a sensible decision. "Coming from Calvin Hurst," Roscoe said afterward, "that is practically a standing ovation." "He is a good man," Dorothy said. "I like him." "He likes you," Roscoe said. "He told me you were the most practical woman he had met since his wife, which is the highest compliment he knows how to give." Dorothy thought about Mrs. Hurst, who had died some years before, of whom Calvin rarely spoke, but always with a particular quiet in his voice that told everything. She thought that she understood very well what it was to lose the person who made your world make sense, and she felt a wave of warmth for the old rancher that surprised her. Roscoe asked her to marry him in November, on a Saturday evening when the desert was turning cold at night in the way it did in the fall, the days still golden and mild, but the nights sharp and clear with a chill that made the stars look particularly brilliant. He did not plan an elaborate scene. He did not need to. She had known it was coming the way you know that something you have been hoping for has stopped being something you are hoping for, and has become something that is simply going to happen. He had come for supper, which she had made, a proper beef stew with cornbread, because she had decided some months ago that the cooking equity in this situation required her to contribute, and she was a better cook than she had let on because she had not wanted to seem like she was campaigning. After supper they sat by the small iron stove, because the evening was cool enough to warrant it, and he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small ring. It was simple. A thin gold band with a small turquoise stone that was the exact color of the Arizona sky on a clear afternoon. He held it in his fingers and looked at her. "I bought this in Tucson last month," he said. "I have been waiting for the right moment, but I think there is not really a right moment. There is just the moment when the thing you want to say is ready to be said. Dorothy, I would like very much to spend the rest of my life being your husband. I would like to build that life with you on the ranch and in this town and whatever else comes. I love you and I will not stop. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and looked at him and said, "Yes, Roscoe," without any reservation at all. He put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly. She looked at it for a moment, that small blue stone catching the firelight. "You had it sized," she said. "Cecilia Morales helped," he admitted. She laughed. "Cecilia knew. She told me your size and did not breathe a word to you," he said. "She is an exceptionally loyal co-conspirator." "I am going to have words with Cecilia Morales," Dorothy said, still laughing. "Be gentle," he said. She seemed to enjoy herself enormously. They were married in the Silver Creek Church in December of 1878, on a Saturday morning when the air was cold and crystalline, and the mountains behind the town had a thin trace of snow on their highest peaks. Cecilia stood up with Dorothy, and a rancher named Tom Birch who had known Roscoe since Texas stood up with him. Calvin Hurst sat in the front pew with the careful dignity of a man who felt the occasion deeply and was not going to let it show too much. The Haskell boys, who had become unlikely fans of their schoolteacher after she had refused to be intimidated by any of them, sat in the back row and were on their best behavior, which was remarkable. Dorothy wore a dress she had made herself from a deep cream-colored wool, with small pearl buttons at the wrist, and she had her hair pinned up with a few small winter jasmine flowers that Cecilia had somehow obtained. She walked down the aisle of the small church and looked at Roscoe standing at the front, and he looked back at her, and his face did the thing it had done that night in her kitchen during the monsoon storm, that same raw and tender and particular thing, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful that she had not let fear win. The ceremony was simple, because they were both people who preferred the plain truth to decoration. The preacher, a Methodist minister named Reverend Cole, read the vows with genuine feeling, and Roscoe said his with that steady deliberateness that meant everything he said meant exactly what it said, and Dorothy said hers with the clear voice of a woman who had made decisions carefully and was standing behind this one completely. When it was done and Reverend Cole pronounced them married, The little congregation of Silver Creek residents who had crowded into the church, which was most of the town, made a noise that was somewhere between a cheer and an ovation, and even old Calvin Hurst clapped his leathered hands together 3 times. They moved into the ranch house that Roscoe had been working on for 2 months, a solid adobe and timber building that he had expanded and repaired and made habitable with the help of Tom Birch and 2 of the other ranch hands. It was not large, but it was well built and well situated, with a wide porch facing east where the morning light came in first, and a kitchen with a proper iron range, and a window above the basin that looked out toward the mountain ridge. Dorothy did not give up the school. She had been clear about that from the beginning, and Roscoe had never once suggested she should. She rode the 4 miles into town on teaching days, which was 5 days a week, and she came home in the early afternoon to the ranch, which was by that point her favorite place in the territory. She liked the rhythms of it, the sound of the horses in the morning, the smell of the land after rain, the way the light moved across the desert through the day like a long, slow conversation between the sun and the earth. Roscoe learned her rhythms and she learned his, and the early months of their marriage were full of that particular and delightful process of 2 people discovering how their lives fit together in the practical details, who liked the window open at night and who preferred it shut, how they managed the mornings when both of them were busy and the coffee had to be made efficiently, who was better at dealing with the ranch accounts, which turned out to be Dorothy by a considerable margin, and who was better at the kind of crisis management that came with livestock, which was Roscoe without question. There were disagreements. They were honest with each other about everything, which meant that disagreements came out into the open rather than festering quietly, and they had a few real arguments in those first months, the kind that came from 2 strong-willed people with defined opinions navigating a shared life. But they had also built the habit of saying what they meant, and it turned out that 2 people who were both committed to honesty could resolve almost anything because there was no foundation of pretense to work around. By the time spring came around again, and the desert exploded into its brief and glorious wildflower season, pink and orange and yellow blooming across the rocky flats in a way that seemed impossible given the apparent harshness of the soil, Dorothy had settled into the ranch and into her marriage with the deep contentment of someone who has found, against their own expectations, exactly the life they actually wanted. She still had the note. She had moved it from the Bible to a small wooden box on the shelf above their bedroom window, a box that also held a few other things she treasured, a pressed flower from their wedding, a letter from her father written the year before he died, a photograph taken in Tucson on their one trip there after the wedding. The note sat on top, its edges soft from folding and unfolding. Roscoe had found her looking at it one evening in the spring, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the note open in her hands and the last light coming orange through the glass. "You still have that," he said from the doorway. "I told you I would keep it," she said. He came to look at it over her shoulder. He had his hands on the back of her chair, and he leaned down and read the words he had written on her porch that summer night with a pencil stub. "I was terrified," he said. She looked up at him. "You did not seem terrified." "I was very terrified," he said. "I thought you might take the paper and hand it back to me and tell me that was the most ridiculous thing you had ever seen." "It was a little bit ridiculous," she said. "Did it work?" he asked. She folded the paper and held it against her chest for a moment. "It worked," she said. He kissed the top of her head and straightened up. "Good," he said, in that tone of his that was satisfaction and understatement in equal measure. Summer came, and with it a piece of news that Dorothy carried inside herself for 2 weeks before she was sure enough to say it out loud, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with Roscoe across from her and the coffee between them. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. He set his cup down and looked at her. The expression on his face was something she had never seen before, something more complex and complete than anything she had seen from him, joy and responsibility and awe all at once, layered together in the way that real feelings are always layered. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am not entirely certain," she said. "I am more certain than not, and the doctor in Tucson will be able to confirm it when we go for the territorial teachers' meeting in September." He reached across the table and took her hand. He held it with both of his, the way you hold something precious, and he looked at her with those brown eyes that had never once told her anything but the truth. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Astonished," she said honestly, "and very happy, and a little afraid in the way you are afraid of things that matter enormously." "Yes," he said, "all of that exactly." They went to Tucson in September and the doctor confirmed it, and they came back to Silver Creek and told Cecilia, who burst into such immediate and genuine happiness that she hugged Dorothy 3 times in a row, and told Calvin Hurst, who shook Roscoe's hand and cleared his throat twice and said that this was good news, which was, as Roscoe had predicted, the closest Calvin ever got to expressing unrestrained emotion. The ranch work had expanded through the year. Roscoe had taken on 2 more ranch hands, a quiet young man from Sonora named Miguel and a red-headed Irishman named Patrick Flynn, who had come west on a cattle drive and decided to stay. The partnership with Calvin Hurst was formalized in full, with Roscoe holding a 30% stake that would grow to 50% over the next several years and would become full ownership in the event of Calvin's death, which nobody was expecting any time soon given that the old man seemed to run on pure Arizona stubbornness. Dorothy had expanded the adult literacy class, and it had grown into something the town was genuinely proud of. She had 14 regular adult students by the fall, including 2 women from the Tohono O'odham community who came in from the reservation on alternating Friday evenings, and she had begun keeping records of their progress that she intended to use as part of a report to the Territorial Education Commissioner in the spring. She believed, with the particular intensity of someone who had thought deeply about a thing, that education on the frontier was not only possible but essential, and that the failure to provide it was a failure of justice as much as anything else. She had occasion to say some of this, carefully and thoroughly, in a letter she wrote to the commissioner in October, which Roscoe read and said was the finest argument he had read in any form since he had read a pamphlet by Frederick Douglass back in Texas as a young man. She was gratified by that comparison. She mailed the letter and received a response in December that indicated the commissioner was interested in her methods and would be visiting Silver Creek in the spring. The baby was born in April of 1880. It was a boy, strong-lunged and emphatic about his opinions from the first moment, with a remarkable amount of dark hair and his father's steady gaze, which was somewhat unnerving in an infant but endearing nonetheless. They named him James Calvin Donnelly, James for Roscoe's middle name and Calvin because they both knew that the old rancher who had given them so much deserved to have his name carried forward. Roscoe was in the house when the baby was born, which was not common practice for men of the time, and Dorothy had been the one to insist that she wanted him there. And he had been there, steady and calm and useful in the way that he was always useful. And when the midwife, a capable Tohono O'odham woman named Maria who had brought most of Silver Creek's children into the world, put the baby into Roscoe's arms for the first time, Dorothy watched her husband hold their son and felt something so large and warm and complete move through her that she had no adequate word for it. Love was part of it. Gratitude was part of it. A sort of profound rightness, as if the world had arranged itself into the shape it was always supposed to have. Calvin Hurst drove out to the ranch on the second day and stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at the baby in the cradle and said, very gruffly, that he was well named. He left a tin of the best coffee he had and disappeared before anyone could see his eyes had gone wet at the edges. James Calvin Donnelly grew quickly, the way ranch babies do, surrounded by space and air and constant activity. He was walking by the time he was a year old and was following Roscoe around the corral by the time he was 18 months, his small boots leaving tracks in the dust that were miniature copies of his father's. Dorothy continued teaching through all of it. She had arranged for Cecilia's eldest daughter, a bright girl of 16 named Rosa, to come to the ranch and sit with James on the teaching days, and the arrangement worked well for everyone, since James adored Rosa and Rosa found the baby considerably more interesting company than her younger brothers. The visit from the Territorial Education Commissioner, a serious man named Mr. Halbert, happened in May of 1880, a month after James was born, and Dorothy conducted it with a nursing baby in the adjacent room and the full confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was talking about. Mr. Halbert was impressed enough by her methods and her documentation to recommend the territorial government fund an additional teaching position for Silver Creek, and to begin circulating her adult literacy program to other frontier towns as a model. Dorothy read the letter of recommendation when it arrived in July, and sat at the kitchen table for a moment feeling something she could only describe as the satisfaction of having built something real. She showed it to Roscoe that evening. He read it carefully, the way he read everything, and looked up at her. "This is an important thing," he said. "It is a good thing," she said. "It means other people will have access to what these people here have built. It means you change something," he said. "Something that will keep going after you are done changing it." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight that had become the setting for so many of the most important conversations of her life. She thought about who she had been when she arrived in Silver Creek, careful and guarded and entirely self-contained, and who she was now, not less herself, not diminished or reduced, but fuller somehow, as if the life she had built had given her more room rather than less. She thought about a piece of paper with a pencil-written declaration on it, sitting in its wooden box on the shelf above their bedroom window. "You know," she said, "I still have that note." He looked up from the letter. "I know," he said. "I have thought about it," she said, "a great many times since that evening, what it meant that you wrote it, what it took to write it." "It took a pencil stub and a loose piece of paper," he said, in that dry way he had. "It took more than that," she said. "It took being the kind of man who understood that actions and proof and honesty mean more than beautiful words. It took being a man who would rather be laughed at than be vague. I want you to know that I have never forgotten it, and I never will." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I was terrified you were going to hand it back to me." "You told me that," she said. "I know," he said. "I am still glad you did not." She stood up and went around the table and kissed him. Not a brief or casual kiss, but a real one, with all the fullness of everything they had built together. And when she pulled back, he was smiling the slow sunrise smile that still, after all this time, did something particular to the interior of her chest. "I am glad, too," she said. Life on the Donnelly-Hurst ranch settled into the deep rhythms of a working place and a full family over the years that followed. The monsoons came every summer and swept the desert clean. The wildflowers came every spring. The cattle grew and were sold and replaced. Roscoe's partnership with Calvin deepened into a friendship that looked more like family than business, and the old rancher was a fixture at their table on Sunday evenings, eating Dorothy's cooking and playing with James, and arguing companionably with Roscoe about the best management practices for the South pasture. Calvin Hurst died in the winter of 1882, peacefully and in his own bed, at the age of 63. He had seen it coming and had made all his arrangements with characteristic practicality, and he left the ranch in its entirety to Roscoe, which surprised Roscoe more than it should have, and which Dorothy had suspected for at least a year. The document was clean and clear and legal, witnessed properly in Tucson before a notary, and when Roscoe came back from the lawyer's office in town with the deed in his hand, he sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. "He trusted you with everything he built," Dorothy said. "He did," Roscoe said. His voice was not entirely steady. "He was right to," she said. He looked at the deed on the table, at his name written there beside Dorothy's name, because Calvin had insisted both names go on the document and had made that instruction very clear. He looked at it for a while, and then he folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box that lived on the shelf in the bedroom now, alongside the note and the pressed flower and the photograph and the letter from her father, because it belonged there with the other things that were irreplaceable. They held a service for Calvin at the Silver Creek Church, and the whole town came, because Calvin Hearst had been one of the men who built this place, and that meant something to everyone. Roscoe spoke briefly and plainly, which was how Calvin would have wanted it, and Dorothy sat in the front pew with James, who was nearly 2 and had the good instinct to be unusually quiet, and she felt the particular sorrow of losing someone who had given you more than you could fully account for. But life on the ranch went forward the way it always did, because that was both the harshness and the mercy of working land. The cattle needed managing. The horses needed training. The fences needed mending. There was always something that required attention and effort, and Dorothy had learned by now that she loved that quality of a ranching life, the way it kept you in the body and in the present, the way it made abstractions irrelevant and what was real and immediate into what mattered. She was pregnant again by the spring of 1883. This time she told Roscoe with less astonishment and more simple happiness, sitting on the east porch in the morning light with their coffee, James toddling around their boots investigating the porch boards for splinters and beetles with equal interest. "Another one," she said. He looked at her and smiled. "Good," he said. "That is all you are going to say." She said, "I mean it very thoroughly," he said. "Good, everything about this is good." The second child was also a boy, born in December of 1883, and named Theodore Arthur Donnelly. Theodore because Dorothy had always loved the name, and Arthur because it had been her father's name. And the baby came into the world with the same emphatic announcement as his brother had. Though where James had his father's steady gaze from the beginning, Theodore had his mother's green eyes and his mother's expression of having already formed a strong opinion about everything. "He looks like he is about to disagree with me," Roscoe said the first time he held him. "He is a Brenner," Dorothy said. "We come out of the womb with opinions fully formed." "I believe that," Roscoe said, completely seriously. James, who was 3, inspected his new brother with the grave seriousness of a senior investigator and pronounced him all right, which everyone agreed was a generous assessment. The Donnelly Ranch grew in the 1880s along with everything else in the territory. The railroad had come closer, which brought new people and new commerce and new arguments about what the territory should become. Dorothy watched the changes with a schoolteacher's attentive eye, noting what improved life for the people of Silver Creek and what threatened to make it smaller or less fair. She had views on land policy, on water rights, on the treatment of the Apache and Tohono O'odham communities, and she expressed them in letters to the territorial government and in conversations with the men who came through town with political ambitions. Roscoe shared most of her views, and where he did not, they had the kind of disagreements that made both of them think harder and come to better conclusions than either would have reached alone. He was not a man who agreed with her to keep the peace. He was a man who argued with her when he thought she was wrong and said so straight, and she had come to value that enormously, the particular respect of being disagreed with honestly. She wrote to the commissioner again in 1884 about the situation of children from the Tohono O'odham community, who were being pressured by territorial policy to attend boarding schools that stripped them of their language and customs. She wrote carefully, and with the full force of her educational authority, and she was clear that she believed it was both unjust and educationally counterproductive to destroy a child's first language and cultural foundation in the name of assimilation. She did not expect to win this argument with the government, and she did not, but she kept making it, because she believed it was right to make it. Maria, the midwife, knew that Dorothy was an ally and told others in her community, and Dorothy made it her business to ensure that the children from the reservation who came to her school were not made to feel lesser or foreign in any way. It was not a perfect situation, because the imperfections were structural and larger than one schoolteacher could fix, but she did what she could within the space she had, and she believed firmly that doing what you could was not optional. Roscoe supported her in all of this, practically and vocally, and she loved him for it with a depth that surprised her sometimes by how much it had grown from the first uncertain love of those early months into something that felt as fundamental as the ground under the ranch house, as necessary as water. The third child was a girl. She was born in the spring of 1886, and they named her Alina Rose Donnelly. Alina for no reason either of them could entirely explain except that it felt right, and Rose for the desert roses that bloomed outside the kitchen window every April without being asked to, and without being tended particularly, simply because that was what they did and they were going to do it regardless. Alina came into the world as if she had been waiting impatiently and was finally getting on with it, and she arrived with the same green eyes as Theodore and her mother's auburn hair, and a personality that asserted itself so early and so clearly that by the time she was 6 months old, everyone who met her understood that she would be a formidable person. James was 6 by then, and Theodore was 2, and the ranch house, which Roscoe had extended twice since they moved in, was full of the particular wonderful chaos of a family that was all different and all themselves, and all tangled up together in the irreplaceable way. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1887, when James was nearly 7 and could ride his pony with genuine competence, when Theodore was 3 and had strong opinions about everything, and was starting to read at a pace that alarmed his older brother and delighted his mother, and when Alina was 1 year old and pulling herself upright on every available piece of furniture, and looking around with those sharp green eyes as if she was cataloging what she intended to do with the world. Dorothy sat on the east porch in the late afternoon light and watched the desert move through its daily conversation with the sun. She had a cup of coffee in her hands. The air smelled of sage and the warm mineral smell of the earth. Somewhere in the corral, one of the horses was making a low, contented sound. She could hear Roscoe in the kitchen, because he had developed over the years a genuinely good skill in the kitchen, not elaborate cooking but solid, reliable things, and he was making the biscuits for supper with a concentration that she found inexplicably endearing. She thought about the woman she had been in 1878, stepping off the stage in Silver Creek with her trunk and her books and her carefully maintained walls, absolutely certain that she was fine on her own and entirely unconvinced by anyone who suggested otherwise. She thought about the note, still in its box on the bedroom shelf. She thought about a man writing down a promise with a pencil stub because she had told him she did not believe him, and she thought about how that single honest gesture had been, somehow, the thing that made it possible for her to open the door she had been standing in front of for a very long time. She thought about what it meant to be believed. To be believed specifically, personally, with evidence on paper, by someone who was willing to look foolish or be refused because he thought you were worth the risk. The door opened and Roscoe came out with his own cup of coffee, the biscuits left to rest in the oven, and he settled into the chair beside her, which was his chair the way this was her porch and this was their ranch and these were their lives, all of it theirs together. He looked at the mountains. She looked at him. "What are you thinking?" he asked without turning because he always knew when she was thinking something. "I was thinking about the note," she said. He looked at her then, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "You think about it a great deal," he said. "I do," she said. "It was important. You made a promise on paper and you kept it perfectly." "That was the plan," he said. "Roscoe," she said. "Yes. I want you to know," she said, and she said it carefully because she wanted to say it exactly right, "that the life we have made here is the best thing that has ever happened to me. And I do not say that because I think you need to hear it or because I am being sentimental. I say it because it is true and because you once told me that words should weigh something, and I want these words to weigh exactly as much as they should." He was quiet for a moment. The desert wind moved through the sage. The sun was dropping behind the mountain ridge, laying out its last broad strokes of orange and gold. "They do," he said. His voice was low and even, the way it always was, But there was something in it that she knew by now, the way she knew the sound of the ranch house settling at night, and the sound of the creek after rain, and the sound of her children sleeping. It was fullness. It was the sound of a man whose life had turned out to be exactly what he hoped it might be. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it, and they sat on the east porch of their ranch in the Arizona Territory in the warm spring evening, watching the sky go from gold to rose to the deep, profound blue that preceded the stars, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Later that night, after supper and after the children were bathed and put to bed in the progressive difficulty that 3 children at 3 different ages represented, Dorothy stood at the bedroom window with the wooden box in her hands. She opened it and took out the note and read it one more time, though she knew it by heart, had known it by heart for years. I, Roscoe Donnelly, being of sound mind and honest intention, do here declare that I am entirely serious in my regard for Dorothy Brenner, that my purpose in calling on her is honorable and permanent, and that it is my sincere hope to one day have the privilege of asking her to share my life with me. I do not make promises lightly, and this paper should stand as proof that this is not a light matter. Roscoe James Donnelly. She folded it and put it back. She put the box back on the shelf. Roscoe came to bed shortly after, and she was already there, reading by the small oil lamp on the nightstand, and he settled in beside her with the ease of a man who had come home to exactly the right place every night for years and knew it. She put her book down and put out the lamp and lay in the dark listening to the desert night, the insects, the light breeze, the distant sound of the horses. "Roscoe," she said, "James is going to need a proper tutor for mathematics soon," she said. "He is already past what I can do with him informally, and the school curriculum is not moving fast enough." There was a pause. "This is what you wanted to talk about at 10 at night," he said, but she could hear the smile in it. "It is practical," she said. "I think we could write to Tucson and see if there is someone qualified who might come out to Silver Creek." "All right," he said. "And I want Alina to learn to ride by the time she is 4, she said. James was riding at 4. "Alina will probably ride at 3 if we let her near the ponies much longer," he said. "She was trying to climb the corral fence yesterday." "She is ambitious," Dorothy said. "She is a Brenner," he said. She smiled in the dark. "She is a Donnelly," she said. "Both things," he agreed. The poor child did not stand a chance of being anything but entirely her own person. She laughed softly, and he put his arm around her and she settled against him, and the ranch settled around them both, and the territory spread out beyond the walls, dark and enormous and beautiful under a sky full of stars. She thought, just before she fell asleep, that she had come to this place not looking for anything, and she had found everything. She had found a purpose in the school and the students and the program that was now being used in 5 other territorial towns. She had found this land that she loved with a ferocity she had not expected. She had found Cecilia and Maria and Calvin Hurst and all the people who had become the fabric of her life. And she had found a man who, when she told him she did not believe he was serious, had reached into his pocket and written it down on a piece of paper with a pencil stub, because he understood that proof was worth more than promises spoken into the air. She had kept the paper. She would keep it always. And she had kept him and he had kept her, and all of it was real and permanent and fully proven, not by words alone but by everything that words had led to. The note, the porch, the ring, the church, the ranch, the children, the years, the life. The wooden box sat on the shelf above the window. Inside the note lay folded among the other irreplaceable things. Outside the ranch house window, the Arizona Territory spread out in the dark, enormous and honest and full of the particular wild promise it had always held, that a person willing to work hard and tell the truth and stay the course could build something real in this country, something that would last. The Donnelly Ranch was proof of that, and the note in the wooden box was proof of how it had begun. A man who meant what he said and a woman smart enough to ask for evidence. A pencil stub and a piece of paper and a promise that had turned into a life full enough to hold everything, The school and the ranch and the children and the Sunday evenings and the monsoon rains and the wildflowers and the mountains and the stars. All of it real, all of it theirs. Dorothy Donnelly closed her eyes in the warm dark of her home, with her husband beside her and her children sleeping down the hall and the desert breathing outside the window. And she slept the deep and dreamless sleep of a woman who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear, and everything she had ever truly wanted already right here, already home.